Welcome back to another episode of Is It Worth Playing, a video series where we go through every single MMORPG, good and bad, in search for the best and at times the worst games in the genre. If you're interested in staying up to date with this series or the latest MMO related news in general, then I urge you to go and click that subscribe button and become a part of our community. Alternatively, you could join us over on Twitch as well, as we stream there every single week. Now today we are taking a look at one of the longest lasting anime MMOs, a game that has withstood the test of time, MapleStory. MapleStory was developed by Wizet and published by Nexon in South Korea in 2003. The game launched shortly after in North America in 2005 and has been one of Nexon's leading intellectual properties since, driving various different spin-offs like MapleStory 2, MapleStory M, and even the MapleStory Fest convention. MapleStory is a very unique type of MMO. It's one of the few side-scrolling action titles within the genre, but where its competitors like Dungeon Fighter Online allow for exclusively horizontal movement, MapleStory allows for both horizontal and vertical exploration. MapleStory is set in an enormous world, yet the world is segregated off from itself, providing players small zones to navigate between, each entirely interconnected via small portals. And before you guys go and jump to any conclusions, let me point out here that these areas, these zones, are in no way instanced. On the contrary, you will find plenty of different players engaging in content, leveling, farming, so many in fact that, and I'm sure many MapleStory players can relate to this, but you end up in fierce competition with them over who's going to ultimately get to keep the spawn of monsters. This is where I believe personally that open world PvP would come in very handy, and why MMOs like Black Desert have flourished. Other players in your way? Don't offer them your hand. Offer them a hand, you know, off of a cliff or onto your blade. Speaking of PvP, let's talk about combat. Side-scrolling MMOs don't offer much in the way of exploration. That's because you're mostly given the option of moving in a very linear form, so these games are required to maintain player interest in other ways. Combat and narrative are often the two main aspects that they seem to narrow in on, and MapleStory is no exception to that. Combat involves binding your abilities to a variety of different keys on your keyboard, as would be expected of any MMO or PC game really. Your abilities come in many different forms: dots or damage over time skills, AoEs or area of effect skills, single target skills, buffs, debuffs. I mean, as absurd as it seems at times, you're actually given abilities that take up the entirety of the screen and deal just massive amounts of damage. These are my types of classes. I have always been fond of grouping up enemies and mowing them all down simultaneously, and MapleStory actually allows for me to really channel that, and on a variety of different classes. Combat itself was very fluid. Abilities flowed effortlessly, spell and skill effects were very high quality, taking somewhat of a comic-esque form, and the best part? There were so many different classes to choose between, with each and every class having not only their own unique abilities, strengths, and weaknesses, but also their personalized custom playstyle, where you often see classes and MMOs reusing many assets from one another. MapleStory doesn't. Well, I mean, you know what? They might, but it's done on a much smaller scale that I have never even realized it. Now, I mentioned two different things that MMOs like this focus on though, right? Narrative was the other. MapleStory has a unique narrative that is specifically targeted and tailored to your respective class. Sure, there's story that carries over between classes, but every class has their own unique identity in this game. And I'm not talking just the odd quests here and there. I'm talking about entire storyline zones that are directly associated with your class and your class only. The sheer amount of effort that they have put into making sure every class has their own unique look and feel, going above and beyond skills and aesthetic appearances, is surprising. And while classes do have their own unique story, while there is a main story to follow more or less, there are also side quests and entire zones and stories disconnected from the world in the form of theme dungeons. These are at times hilarious to move through and complete, each having their own story to follow, their own cast of characters, their own monsters, and subsequently their own rewards. MapleStory has a unique graphical style to it. I'm not sure how many of you recall that anime. I mean, I want to say MMO here because it shares a lot of MMO features, but I guess it's more of an online community that like takes on the form of a video game. It's called Gaia Online. MapleStory shares, in my opinion, very strong aesthetic similarities to Gaia Online, with the exception being that MapleStory is a horizontal action MMO. Environments look great, sure. The backgrounds have a tendency to repeat several times in a row between zones, as do the enemies, with enemies typically being different colors as you move through the zones in question. But every area, not zone specifically, but every area has its own unique look and feel to it. Characters take the form of sprites, chibi like pixel art. Opinions seem to vary between whether or not the game is cartoon inspired or anime inspired, interestingly enough. Honestly, while I can see aspects of both present, I would say that in my opinion, it takes a lot more inspiration from anime than it does from cartoons. Sometimes the backdrops look much more 3D than the characters themselves, as the environments aren't as limited as the character models. But then again, this game is almost 2 decades old by this point, and honestly, graphically it holds up exceptionally well. There are hundreds of levels to grind through in MapleStory, with the leveling process taking the form of monster grinding. Not entirely, but predominantly. I'm well aware that this doesn't appeal to every type of player. As a matter of fact, I'm certain that spending weeks, months even, to grind levels on a variety of different classes is not the majority of players' definition of a fun, engaging MMO. Yet MapleStory has maintained a very loyal player base of players that have absolutely no issue with the grind. I spent about 10 days playing on and off for approximately 2 to 3 hours per day, and I think I made it to just a little shy of level 100, and that was, I think at this point, roughly 1/3 of the way to max level. And let me tell you that these were the easier levels to achieve, and they were also done with XP potions from the cash shop, as I didn't want to do this without the option of doubling my XP. I have been there, I have done that many years ago. As grinding monsters is in essence the core of the game, I understand why most people shrug this game off when it comes to playing it. Well, I mean that and the issues with Nexon ruining it just like everything they touch. But for fans of grinding, there isn't a better anime game out there. For its age, MapleStory holds up exceptionally well graphically. You will not find another game that looks as good as this one does within its respective genre. Its combat is still, even in 2021, some of the best in the side-scrolling MMO category. The narrative is ridiculously expansive, encompassing not only the main story, but class stories and stories disconnected from the world itself. It also somehow continues to receive regular updates in the form of content and new classes. Yet even though the game receives regular updates, new players seem to shy away from playing it because of many glaring issues that the game has and has had for many years now. One of which is horrendous pay to win, something that Nexon loves to ruin all of their games with. While the combat looks and feels fantastic, that's pretty much all you do in the game. You grind monsters, which grows tedious very fast. The leveling experience post level 100 is pretty uninspired, as what made pre-level 100 entertaining, at least for me, was the variety of content to do outside of grinding. Thankfully, there are 2 different ways that you can play MapleStory. You can go with the default servers, or you can go with the reboot servers, which are much more free-to-play friendly. Regardless of what you choose, MapleStory is an incredibly fun game with some highly addicting mechanics that you will not find elsewhere. From its combat to its graphical style to its narrative, this is a high-quality title that I would advise not overlooking. Unless you dislike Nexon, in which case go right ahead, because at the end of the day, it is Nexon after all, and they are the same way with every one of their games.
Someday soon, I'm gonna make it.